I'm Cynthia Struthers. I'm the person that's been sending you all those emails. I thank you for all showing up this morning. We have, I think, a very good program, and we're starting with our panel discussion this morning, and you don't want to hear me talk. So I'm going to throw this right over to the panel discussion. I will just mention that I asked the panel to do the following. I gave them 4 questions to answer. The first one was, what is your background in teaching prior to coming to the University of Waterloo? The second was, the biggest challenges I experienced in my first year of teaching at Waterloo. Number 3, the best thing that happened to me in my first year of teaching at Waterloo. And number 4, my best piece of advice to a new instructor at the University of Waterloo. I noticed, though, I can't count. Did you notice that? I've got 1, 2, 3, 3. Oh, well, I'm just a mathematician. So, are we going to start with you, Gregor? We'll start with Gregor, who is from the Department of Computer Science.
Okay, good morning. I'm Gregor Richards. I started last September. I guess we all started around that time. That's the point. So I got my PhD at Purdue, and at Purdue I actually did get to teach courses. I taught a 300 level course on compilers. I also did, of course, the usual TA rounds of doing recitations and teaching labs and all that kind of thing. So I had probably relatively extensive, really, teaching coming in beforehand, because probably a lot of people come in and haven't taught at all, or maybe they've just done a few TA things. I had actually completely designed and taught a course while at Purdue. And I think probably the biggest difference in terms of my teaching experience at Purdue and the teaching experience here is the amount of sort of, I'm trying to find the most positive word to put here, but sort of control that you can share between yourself and either other faculty, or if you're in a larger, lower level course, the instructional support group. That at Purdue, I taught this 300 level course that ended up having 97 students in it, and it was me and a few TAs, and that was it. And what I got from previous courses was sort of, here's all the things we did wrong, and, if you want to do it completely differently, then do that. And nobody agreed on how the course should look, and there was no sort of continuous idea of this is what this course should look like, because there was nobody who owned it, there was nobody who really cared so much about it, and so it was, okay, yep, you're teaching it, design the course, do everything, it'll be great. Which was, it turned out all right, but I don't necessarily like that level of control. Here, I taught 241, which is basically the equivalent class, a undergraduate compilers course. And with these very large classes, you have instructional support, you have, faculty who have been teaching the same class for 50 years. You have lots of TAs that can help you out, and so the amount of work that you end up having to do is less, but also the amount of control that you have over the class is less, and so there's that sort of struggle of, well, I would like to do this differently because I think it makes more sense for me, or I just think it's a better way to teach the course or something, but there are 3 other instructors teaching this course and 50 TAs and, droves of people who have been doing this for years, and so I don't really have that same level of control. Then I also taught 842, and of course once you get to an 800 level course, that's all turned around, you're completely in control, you design everything, but it's also sort of more casual because it's a graduate level course in the first place. So I think, one of the biggest surprises was just the level of sort of support and control, and how much that was different from my previous experiences, and just the fact that varies so much by sort of which course it is and how, well, really even how you just want to handle the situation. So it is nice that with these lower level courses you can sort of okay, previous faculty who has taught this, please give me all of your notes, and then I will barely turn on my brain and teach the course, which makes things easier, but it does mean that you have less sort of yourself put into your teaching. In terms of positives, I guess that was neutral comments, not entirely positive, not entirely negative. In terms of positives, I found the students are 5 steps ahead of me, always. Teaching 241, you're always trying to judge the class and see, okay, should I slow down for this part? Should I go into more detail? Should I skip over this? And, the class is, yeah, we get that. We got it an hour ago. Please move on. There's not enough material to cover everything they could conceivably learn at this rate. So it's difficult just because we really do have the best students in the country. It's difficult to challenge them. It's difficult to really keep up to pace and always have something that's going to keep them challenged. And of course, there's the usual problem that there is a range, and so you have to sort of keep the ones who are not getting it quite so well engaged while not boring the ones who are 10 steps ahead of you too much. So, the students being constantly ahead of me was a surprise. And of course, then there's this degree of control that you do or don't have. So, just sort of adapting to the students, I think, was, I was impressed by that. And in fact, a student approached me and is now doing a URA with me because these students are 10 steps ahead of me at all times, and so they're definitely ready for doing research work and that kind of thing. So that's a big boon. I have a URA student now who I previously knew was good. That's great. What was the last question? Oh yes, best piece of advice. I think just make sure that you take advantage of what's there, because there are faculty who have already been teaching this. There's the instructional support. Just, be aware of what's available and take advantage of it. People are very willing to give you their notes from previous classes, thoughts on what went right and what went wrong. Don't, try to make everything. A lot of it is already there, and just go with what's already there. Take advantage of those resources that are available. I think that's it for me.
Thanks, Gregor. Fan, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Fan Yang. So I from the Stat and Exci department. So before I came to Waterloo, I taught at the Gregor University in the States for 2 years. And before I taught there, of course, I was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. And I was also TA. I TA discussion sections, and also I was an independent instructor for one course. So I guess I also sort of have some teaching experience before I came here. But I think the biggest difference after I got here, I think, is that Waterloo students are very motivated. So you definitely want to prepare yourself very well for the class, just in case they will challenge you in class, right? You don't want to have a hard time there, okay? So for the biggest challenge I had was a class size. So in the first term, I taught the class was over 200 students. Before that, I only taught at most 50 students in the class. So you can imagine I taught in a big lecture hall. And so the problem for me was a classroom control, classroom management, right? So how do I attract their attention for 75 minutes? And if someone talking there, what should I do? And things like that. So at the very beginning, I had a really hard time. So I talked to my colleagues and very experienced my colleagues. I got a lot of help from them. I got tricks and tips and how to control the class. Of course, I'm still improving on that, working on that, but I think it's much better. So my advice for that part would be just talk to your colleagues if you're also teaching a big class. And definitely that's something you need to learn to think about how to control it. And also the resources from the whole department, the faculty, and the whole university are very good. Like last year, we had the CTE faculty come to videotape my class. That helped me a lot, so I can actually see what I look like in the class. So I definitely benefit from that a lot. So the best thing I had in last year, I think, it was like one day after class, some student came talk to me. He said, well, the class is very interesting, so he actually decided to choose exercise as his major later on. So actually, I never thought about that before. So I didn't expect I have some impact on students, like on their future plans. I find that very amazing. Teaching is really rewarding. When you input something, you definitely get something out. But at the same time, that reminds myself I have to be very responsible for the students, right? My job is not just to convey the knowledge, but also to give some more like a model or something. You definitely have to be responsible for them. Okay. So the last part is the best piece of advice. I think to teach at Waterloo, combine all the points I taught before to get well prepared for the class. Maybe my best advice. So I think everything, all the tricks or tips, techniques you learned from others, all based on your control on the materials, right? When you are very familiar with everything you're gonna say, then you have the flexibility to do something other than teach. Other than just talking about the knowledge, right? So to get well prepared for the class is definitely my advice. Even the materials for you, like 1+1, that easy, still get prepared for that. Otherwise, you will have hard time. So maybe another small suggestion for probably more for girls, because at the very beginning, because my classroom control and there are several colleagues and my teacher mentor visit my class. So one of the advice they give to me is like my dress. So I'd better dress a little bit more formal. So some sort of create some distance between you and the students, right? You don't want to look like you are just a college student, so that they. Of course, you want to be easygoing, but not that type of easygoing. So from after that, I try to dress a little bit more formal. Before that, I'm too casual, just like college students, I guess. So I guess that's just my little advice for girls, probably. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Men can dress more formally too.
Thanks, Van. On to Owen.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Owen Woody, and I've never really escaped orbit here at the University of Waterloo. My path here at least went to different departments. I started doing my bachelor in computer science here, and I'm just at the tail end of my PhD in biology. And the common trend to this was bioinformatics, this big computing problem with tons of biology data. But my experience teaching prior to coming to the math department had been largely biology-oriented. And in the biology universe, you've got your PowerPoint presentation with all your facts, and you can use that as, here's the information, and now I'm just going to talk about it. And you can look at your audience and gauge what they're understanding, figure out what level of discourse is appropriate, and just sort of go from there. So I developed a reputation as being a good speaker based on lab meetings and volunteer talks, and I was eventually given one sessional in biology. So I had done one boutique course with a small number of third-year students in biology before I came here, and I taught a large section of math students. And I think the single biggest challenge for me to make that transition was getting used to speaking and writing on the board at the same time. So most of you probably are from math, and maybe this isn't as big of an issue for you, but when I came to this very session last year, my plan was, okay, I've got the notes that say what I want to talk about right in front of me. Let's do an experiment. Let's not rehearse exactly what I'm going to write on the board, and let's do it biology style. Let's get the level of interest, see what people can talk about, and then I'll write as appropriate. And what I quickly discovered was, that should be written on the board. I'd go start writing. But then everything that started coming out of my mouth was nonsense. And I was like, oh, this is not good. So I better switch gears here. I have to pay more attention to what I'm saying. And then what I'd write on the board would be nonsense. And I was like, oh, this is a disaster. And I'd like to imagine that was the worst lecture I will ever give under any circumstances. But it was a good warning experience. And eventually I came up with a system where I planned out what I was going to write on cue cards as sort of my emulation of the board space. And I came up with a system that worked, but I was surprised that was such a big issue for me. So if you haven't gone through this experience of writing and talking at the same time, maybe give it a couple practice sessions. That was probably my biggest challenge. To switch to a more positive note, I'm interested in teaching as a career, and I had a rather unique opportunity over this first year of teaching. The very first course I taught was a section of a math course that was off the usual stream of courses. So what that meant was most of the students had taken it before and had a bad time. So I was a first-time instructor seeing the course as it was for my first time, and these students already had their grudges. So I had my notes from previous offerings of the course, the textbook, and I'd start my lecture, and then the hands would shoot up and go, okay, here's where I was confused last time, right on this example right here. And they were prepared for this, and I was not. So it was a lot, oh, you're right. Based on what's in the notes here, that is kind of hard to follow. And the positive out of this was I was subsequently given a chance to teach that course a second time. And it was very interesting to see how well the lessons from that first offering carried over to the second. And if I poured a lot of time into reinforcing the lectures that were weak and addressing the sections that I knew the students would find confusing based on either the textbook or their prior background, the feedback from students was very positive and very rewarding. There was one lecture in particular where I went completely off script. I thought, this part of the textbook is awful. I'm going to design my own approach for this topic and see what they think. And afterwards, the students came to me and said, I really liked that lecture. That made a lot of sense. I was like, really? Because that was the one I wasn't sure was going to fly. And so it's interesting from the perspective of a rewarding career that you can put more time into these lectures and get more out of it. And having 1 year under my belt, I still think there's a lot of room to really refine and tweak all these lectures, and I think that's a really exciting experience. As for my biggest piece of advice, and I can sort of tie in a second big problem here, my suggestion, and your mileage may vary, is to be as consistent and predictable as possible. And I feel like I'm going to be parroting part of the package of material you've all been given as first-year lecturers, but if you're going to start right at the top of the hour, always start right at the top of the hour. If you're going to look at your briefcase when you're about to finish your lecture, always look at your briefcase when you're about to finish your lecture. And it sounds silly, but I was in a habit of every Monday I would say, okay, the new assignment has been posted and it's due on Friday. And I would do this every single week, and finally around week 8 I was like, this is silly. The students get it. I'm wasting their time. So on week 8 I just started into the material, and hand immediately shoots up, when is assignment 8 going to be posted? Really? So just, they are going to latch on to any behavior patterns you have, and perhaps the most important circumstance for this is when it comes to marking. If you have one of these sections with 1,000 students and you've got 100 of them, inevitably you're going to have students that come to you with their homework and they're going to get 2 out of 5 on some problem, and they'll find the one student in some other section who got 5 out of 5 for the same solution. And they'll go, the system has failed me, give me my marks. And the position I try to take is I try and explain to them that I'm trying to make this experience as even and as comparable for as many students as I can. And if I allow this particular trick once, I have to allow that for everyone, and it's just not sustainable. So I try and give them perspective, like this is one small mistake. It's not gonna, if you can argue that your answer was right, you probably understand the material. It's all gonna come out in the end. And really, you just have to imagine what we as instructors are really capable of doing without having this snowball knock-on effect of applying this to everyone. And if you do this with enough guile, students will come to see you as another victim of the system rather than their personal torturer. And I think that's a more healthy learning environment, and it helps because then eventually they'll come, here's what you taught us, here's the mistake I made, and this probably applies to other students as well. So maybe when you give me marks here, you will be, and it's helpful from a teaching perspective as well. So that's my piece of advice: be consistent, be fair, and students will appreciate it.
Thanks, Owen. And on to Edith.
Hi, I'm Edith. I'm in computer science. I got my PhD at Carnegie Mellon. Before I started last year, I really had no teaching experience. I had done a lot of TAs, just like a lot of grad students have done. But in terms of teaching an entire course, I have never, ever done it. So out of this panel, I'm probably the least experienced person. So last year, I taught a graduate level seminar in my first semester, and then I taught CS 349, which is a third year course on user interfaces. And I taught 2 sections of that, and with about 60 students in it each. So for the graduate level course, it was a reading course where people read like 3 or 4 papers, or 2 or 3 papers a week, and then they do a course project. And the challenge there is that it's an interdisciplinary course, so it's a course on human in a loop systems. So we look at what happens when you put human in a loop of intelligent systems. And so part of the course is about AI machine learning, and the other part of the course is about human-computer interaction. So a lot of the reading that we do is actually span like basically many disciplines, and so some students are scared of reading very technical AI paper when their interest is actually in HCI. So, but that actually turned out to be okay after you have kind of settled the nerve and say it's okay if you don't understand half of the paper, you just have to understand the gist of it. And the other part about seminar course is to get the discussion going. Sometimes it's tricky. Especially maybe in math and computer science, students they're not used to talking in class, right? Maybe in some other fields like psychology or something, discussion is just a general thing that people do. So I still haven't really quite find the right way to do it. I ended up, marking down when people are talking in class, and that did get the discussion going pretty well, but then I think some students don't appreciate that because they find that they're pressured to talk even though they don't have anything to say. So that's something to keep in mind if you were going to do that. For my undergrad course, we actually took the course and completely revamped it. So it used to be on, they used to teach Java and X Windows, and which we thought was a little bit outdated in terms of user interfaces, so we turned the entire course into web-based. So that was a lot of work, right? So every week, basically I have to come up with new type of lectures. We have to redo all the homework. And so one of the biggest challenge there is that a lot of students go on co-op, right? So some of them have done like 3 or 4 work terms, 3 work terms by then already, and some of them may be web development. Right. So some students come in, they have already programmed an entire website, and other students come in, they have never seen JavaScript before. And so that we didn't really anticipate in this first time that we offer the course. So the same course is actually taught again this summer, and this goes back to the continuity thing. So the person who is teaching it during the summer, we actually coordinated, and he asked us about our experience turning this course into web-based, what worked, what didn't work. And so we told him that, there's this wide range of ability. So maybe a tutorial on the topic for the students who haven't seen JavaScript and HTML before would be really useful, and he adopted that. And you know, second time around or a third time around, the course becomes better and better. And the other challenge I find is this difference between conference style talking and teaching in a more conversational style. So I'm used to, you know, conference presentations, right? So you like have your slides ready and you just talk about the material. And the thing I always worried about before going to a lecture is, do I have enough stuff to talk about, right? It's like, I have an hour and a half, do I have enough material to cover that? And eventually I realized, you know, that you can do the lecture in a very different style, right? It's more conversational, you can do a lot of Q&A. And when that happens, actually, I don't have enough time to cover everything. And it's actually more fun because you get the whole class going and, you know, it's more interactive. But it's kind of an acquired skill. It takes a while to get used to that, to be comfortable with not having a script to read from. But I think that's something that's a challenge, and it's also something it will improve over time. The best thing to happen, I guess, is like a lot of students, they learn something in class and then they go away and they try it out in a completely different context, and they come back and show you like, oh, look, you know, I've done this like somewhere else. Or they will be like, oh, I found a relevant website or a video that relates directly to what you talked to. Maybe you can incorporate it in your next class or something. And I find that really, I always like it when that happens, because it means that they just, without me asking them to, they took something that they learned from class, applied it somewhere else, and then excited to come and share it back in class. Best piece of advice, I have two things. I think one is that students are not that scary. They're usually quiet, but then when you get to know them, they actually have very interesting thoughts and questions. And the other piece of advice is, if you're not a morning person, then good luck with the 8:30 classes. Especially when there's a snowstorm and like half the class won't show up anyways, and we still have to teach the class. Yeah, I would love to hear if anybody else have advice for 8:30 classes, how to handle those.
If you're not a morning person, you will be one soon.
All right. Thank you very much, panel. That was great. So I'm going to open it to the audience to ask questions. I'm sure you must have some. Who has a question for our panel? Shane.
How do you refer to yourself? Do you use your first name? Do you use doctor?
Apparently we're going in the same order. So I find that at the graduate level, I prefer to be called Gregor, and at the undergraduate level, I prefer to be called professor or instructor. I think it's just, when it's at that scale, you kind of need a bit more distance, and you can still, you know, have the personal interactions while having that sort of hierarchy and respect there. And it's necessary, because it's like, at a certain point, you're just gonna, you know, drop the hammer and say, okay, this is the grade you got, blah, 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 and there's no real discussion of that. And so having that sort of distance is important. But at the graduate level, it's a bit more silly, and so I go with first name, but probably other people have different strategies.
Yeah, for me, actually, I always go just for my first name. Like at the end of the email, I'll always just put my first name. Well, when I taught at the Duke University, some my colleagues, they always very restrict on this part. They say, oh, you have to call me doctor, you are not professor. Like, I find that sometimes too restrictive, but I guess that also creates some distance between you and the students. Like, they know who is a boss here, right? Now, you can do anything, we're not friends, something. But I guess I always just follow my professors in the university, they always just call themselves for first name, so I just follow the same rules. Yeah.
With the students I had, it was the science students taking their 1 math credit, or perhaps 2 math credits, depending on their program, and then they're done. I found it was very difficult to get them to actually approach me and confess their problems. So I just went on a first name basis to try and lower as much as possible that hurdle of approaching and walking in 3 months into the term and admitting, I really don't understand limits, I've been faking it this whole time. And I think anything that makes that interaction possible or easier for the student might be better. So I just go with Owen.
I haven't really thought about it. I think the students, just like the undergrads, just naturally will call you Professor so-and-so, especially, I think, because there's a big Asian population too. They're just not used to calling their senior like by their first name. So I have never really forced people to call me like by my first name. They just naturally, that's the first thing they would use is Professor Law or something, which I'm still trying to get used to, actually. Yeah, I don't know if there's a best, which way there's a best way or something.
I mean, my perspective would be it's going to depend a lot on you, what class it is actually an important thing because it's part of how you present yourself, but it's going to depend on you, your particular students, and even so my teaching style is fairly friendly and aloof, as one might guess from my insane appearance. And so having students call me professor instead of Gregor sort of takes away from that, which is important because otherwise I'm just the goofball, and having that is actually a nice addition. If your teaching style is more authoritative, then maybe with this, you want the students to be able to approach you. Maybe there it's more helpful to go with first name, and I do think it is an important thing to consider, but it's just going to depend a lot on your teaching style and the students and the situation.
Maybe I'll go to some of our experienced teachers in the audience. Dina, what do you do?
I don't have a specific rule. I think I introduce myself at the beginning of the semester just as Dina Dawood, this is my name. And I then have students that will naturally just say, hi miss, hi prof, hi this, and I just don't tend to correct them. I still sign my emails just with my first name. But yes, I would agree in that the science students especially, they like to kind of feel that you are more on a casual basis just because this type of material terrifies them. So when you do have that level of, I wouldn't say it's very casual, but it helps them connect with you a little bit better. But yeah, you always get the pool of students that will still insist on calling you prof, and it's up to them.
Benoit, what would you say?
I actually don't care. And the reason is I'm teaching mathematics. I know what's right in mathematics. Students actually figure out very quickly that I know mathematics, and that's the level of authority I have. I don't feel I need to increase my authority by having a title. So the other thing is my last name is hard for many Anglophones to pronounce. So some people, and I just let them be comfortable. A lot of funny thing happened. I remember in one class I was teaching, all the students were calling me Benoit, but my TA would call me Professor Charbonneau. And I just let them call me the way they want. What I won't allow is disrespect, but I don't think this is disrespectful by saying I mean, if they were saying, hey dude, I would find this would be maybe a little disrespectful, or if they write their email and they could be very impolite, but if they're polite, whichever form of address they use is fine with me.
Thanks. Do we have another question for our panel? Yes.
I'm wondering about if in courses where you've had some control over this, because I know you don't always, what sort of things would you recommend not doing for grading schemes? I would recommend doing.
I think the important thing is just consistency. Whatever you say, you have to stick with that 100%. And if you don't, somebody will calculate their own scores and point out how you gave them a minus when they deserved not to have the minus or something. Beyond that, I mean, I think every course probably needs a very different grading scheme because it's going to depend on the particular course. So just consistency is what I would say.
Yeah, consistency is very important through the whole term, right? And not even just through the whole term, and when you grade the same assignment, definitely you want to be the same to every student, right? The same standards. But for me, the problem is because it was a very big class, so I don't grade anything. My TAs grade all of them. So you have to set the very clear rule to TAs what the marking scheme to them, right? They have to follow it strictly. Otherwise, you have 8 TAs to grade 8 parts, and probably you get totally different results, and they will compare friend, right? The students, if they're friend, they will compare. They will, well, such things you can never avoid. Always their students come to me, why he get this, but I didn't, something like that. So, but you just have to try your best to set up the scheme to the TAs, I guess. Yeah.
Certainly, consistency is a big issue, but students absolutely love it when there are these contingency plans and alternative marking schemes where if they crash on the midterm, they shift the weight to the final, and it's amazing how much hope that gives students. And if the end goal is to have students learning and engaged throughout the whole course, you can avoid having students that think they're like walking corpses because they flunked the midterm if you have these schemes in place. And almost always, if you sit down at the end of the course and look at the grades these students get in all these schemes, it's virtually the same. But I think it's often worth considering having these backup grading schemes in place if you can apply them fairly and consistently in a way students believe. In particular, if you introduce them at the start of the course rather than, oh wow, the midterm was a disaster, let's all come up with a contingency plan together. But when you have that liberty, it is pretty useful for keeping students engaged.
So for the undergrad course, we had a lot of students, like in total we had 200 something students. So the assignments that we have are all, programming user interfaces, which is a little bit hard to grade, right? And so the description of the assignment is very, very thorough. So that was one way we try to have a very detailed description to an ambiguous description so that students would not be confused about what they're supposed to produce. And so if you look at the assignment page, it's like, something like 5 pages long of like just description of what is expected. The other part that's like we're still maybe trying to work out is the course has this history, right? And so, the deadlines that we set for the students is pretty strict. And so if they don't submit something by a certain time, they get 0. And I don't know if that's the best way. It has been done like that for the last 10 years. But what I find is that when they get 0, a lot of students started having excuses for why they didn't hand in something. Right, so the day right before the deadline, I would get lots of I've been sick for the last 2 weeks, and I can't finish the assignment. And I would get probably 5 or 6 of those every time there's a deadline, right? And so having a way to I don't know how I would do with the late assignments, but maybe having a more lenient or maybe alternative ways to get marks or something would be useful.
In your little package, I've included some material on some what I think are useful things to help you get started. And in there is my course outline for Stats 230. 900 students, 5 instructors, 3 tutorial tests, 2 midterms, a final exam. And in there you'll see a very extensive what happens if you miss this test? Where does the weight go? And also this idea that you could bomb one of the midterms and recover. And I've found since being clear about what happens under, let's call it extenuating circumstances, well laid out right from day one, also with a comment that with all these many students in the course, we try to treat everybody fairly and equally, that there are much fewer issues around I'm sick, okay, fine, just give me your documentation, this is what happens. And it just really cuts down on the traffic to my office about stuff that I just don't want to have to deal with. When I see my students, I want to talk about the course and the problems that we're looking at in the course. Don't want to talk about, they had a bad midterm and what happens now. It's all in the course outline and clearly laid out, and it's, at least to me, it looks like we've thought about it a great deal, what's fair, and this is what we go with. So.
It depends on whether it's helpful or not. I mean, sometimes, somebody's just an ass and you just, whatever. It's better if you can sort of take it water off a duck's back rather than being offended. But, like I said, these students are really keen, and often they will say things that make you go, oh yeah, that was wrong, and I should take that to heart and actually do something about it. And they, when it's that situation, they mean well and listen to it and try and do what they ask or make whatever. And, sometimes it's not possible, and if it isn't, then oh well, but it's, if it's constructive, then it's often helpful, so take it to heart. And if it's not, then oh well, you have a disgruntled student. We all have hundreds.
Yeah, I guess depends on how you get a negative feedback, right? But I guess usually I got them from my teaching evaluation. And I have never had a student just come directly to me or talk in class, talking about some negative things to me. Other occasion would be they will write an email to me, maybe say something that you don't like to hear. But again, based on if it is useful or not. If it's useful, definitely you want to follow that, right? Correct maybe something, the same thing as in the teaching evaluation, I guess. So.
My personal tendency is to take all negative feedback far too seriously. And the way I rationalize this to myself and try and make myself feel better is, if you imagine the perspective of the student, often the most disgruntled students are the ones that aren't doing well in your course. So basically for 3 or 4 months, you've been telling them they stink. So when you put that spin on things and then you read their criticism with that in mind, you can still take out grains of truth and reflect on what you've done and go, yeah, maybe that wasn't working, particularly for these students that were struggling, but it gives you some perspective on their tone.
I've seen a funny video of, I think it was produced by some people at SFU, Simon Fraser University. It's really funny. So I would encourage you to watch that video before you read your teaching evaluation. It's basically a bunch of professors reading the worst teaching comment from students with a straight face, and some of them are really funny.
I'm like Owen. I take them all. Any comment I get that's not good, if they don't love me, I take it personally. Why? How could you not love me? And I used to, like, after I got my evaluations, I'd be in a funk for a month, and even if it was just 1 or 2 comments. So when you get your course evaluations, you might have a drink with you. But I think my worst comment ever was, the only reason this woman has a job here is because her husband has a job here, which was just so awful for me at so many levels that I can't tell you how hurtful that was. I'm sure they just, they were disgruntled because they hadn't got a good mark. But it took me a long time to get over that remark. And in fact, even when I say it now, it just, it still hurts. So we all have to find our ways of dealing with the negative comment. Along those lines, I might also indicate in your folder is something called a midterm evaluation, which I highly recommend that you do, depending on your course, 2 to 3 weeks in. Get some quick feedback from your students, especially if it's, you haven't done a lot of teaching. If you ask them what's working, what's not working, and what maybe should I start doing, it's incredibly useful feedback. And then if you go back to class after you've collected this information and say, I've heard that you do not like this, and I'm going to do this to change it. They really, really do appreciate that you're listening to them and that you're trying to make changes that you've heard about from them. Now, there are some, for example, that you just say, you know what? I've heard you don't like this, but the reason I do this is because of this and this. So often just explaining why, something about your teaching pedagogy, why you choose to use a mix of slides or board, or why you want to use board, or why you want to use slides, is, they're bright students. If they have a good reason for what you're doing, they'll pick up on that. So I would recommend that, as well as the other word of advice I have is do a midterm evaluation. And I know this is going to be scary, but have yourself videotaped. And again, have that done in the first month. As teaching fellow, I've done a lot of observations. And one of the things I've really realized is that when you're on this side of your face, what you think is going out is not always what's received. But when you watch yourself being videotaped, it's a real eye-opener. I know it's scary, but it's also very, very useful so that you can have, oh, I didn't realize that I'm actually coming across as not being very, you might be kind of wishy-washy, and you realize that that doesn't play very well. It looks like you don't know what you're talking about, whereas you were trying to be casual or whatever. And you only see that when you're on, in some sense, when you're on the other side of your face. And that can only happen if you have a videotape of yourself. So, Paul Cates, can you put up your hand, Paul? Paul helps to organize those videotapings. And he too will, it's only for your eyes only. And if you ask Paul to have a look at it and give you some feedback, that's also very useful. You need to get feedback early. Don't wait for your course evaluations. It's too late. That course is gone. So why not do something in the first month so you get some feedback from the students?
I want to echo the sentiment about the midterm evaluation form. I used that exact form in 241, and it was incredibly helpful. And it was the case that, there were, maybe a third of the things that people mentioned that I really couldn't do anything about. It was just, okay, this is how the course has to go. I'm one of 3 instructors, and so, yeah, I'm kind of stuck with that. But I just, I talked to that with the students, and there was an understanding, and the things that they thought could be improved, I did improve. And then, yeah, things were a lot smoother after that. So just, opening that line of dialogue is very helpful. And having it be such a, explicit way of please fill out this form. You don't have to if you don't want to. And then, we'll have a brief chat about it. Makes it more likely to actually get those kinds of comments when you could use them rather than after the course is over with the teaching evaluations.
I think we have time for one more question. How many are scared about next week? I finally got to the stage It took a long time before I can now go into my first class and I don't have the butterflies. I still lose some sleep the night before, but I can walk into the class and I feel comfortable. But it took an awful long time for that to happen. So it's okay to be scared. Benoit.
You want me to answer Edith's question about how to be there at 8:30?
Sure.
2 tricks. You have to realize you're weak. And so you're particularly weak in the morning. So you have to get into a new habit. Whatever time you set your alarm clock in the evening is the time you will get up in the morning. You have to make a decision once and never deviate from it, and realize that you'll be weak in the morning. And very often when I had class at 8:30 and I set my alarm clock at 6, when I woke up I realized, I don't want to get up. But I know I'm weak right now, I have no choice. I made a decision yesterday. So, second thing, be in your office at 7:45. Aim to be at the office at 7:45 even though you have an 8:30 class. Now, what will happen in reality is that there'll be snowstorm, there'll be various delays, there'll be a traffic jam. You might be there at 8, but you will not be stressed because you have enough time and you'll have time to wake up and be ready for your 8:30.
Well, actually, so that's part of the question, but the other question is how to get the students there at 8:30, which is the bigger question. Because like my 8:30 class is the attendance is way lower than the 10 o'clock class.
Give them the 2 tricks.
Give them the
That's good. All right. Well, we have to make our way down to MC 2065 for the next session. Maybe you want to grab some food here. There's also food down there, so we got lots of food. Let's finish by thanking our great panel. Thanks, guys.